all three of us.
Yeah, you've been here. I've been out for some medical reasons, and you've been traveling.
I've been traveling,
so.
been to Australia and back.
Yep.
Twice. Yep. Actually. Not that I planned it that way, but.
Yeah,
So anyway.
So it's good to
I could tell Georgia was back because the first two articles are on genetics.
They are.
Talk about a bias.
I did that on purpose. I'm back. I'm doing Answers News. I want to do this. So all right.
Okay, this first interesting article.
Yeah, it's sad. Daredevil and Flat Earth theorist Mad Mike Hughes dies in rocket crash. So this is a gentleman who believes that the Earth is flat, and he built his own rocket, and he actually did successfully launch it a couple of years ago.
It was a steam-driven rocket.
Some tests.
Yeah, steam powered. Went up about 2,000 feet, but this time he was trying to go higher. He was trying to go 5,000 feet, and sadly that did not happen, and it crashed, and he died as a result of that.
Yeah, and it's interesting. You now have all these conspiracy theories coming out. Have you seen some of that?
Death.
Yeah.
It's really interesting. Like, oh, maybe the government took his body away, and maybe they sabotaged it.
But what I don't understand is that we actually go much higher than 5,000 feet in airplanes and
well,
also
even on mountains. You can go up on a mountain
with
and you're much higher
satellites
than
and
that.
even on mountains. And why did he think that was going to show the flat Earth?
Because I don't think he believes I don't think he believes a lot of these other things that people supposedly have shown or photographed or videoed before.
You know, I've been to Gatlinburg, and when you're down in Gatlinburg, you can go up on that mountain that kind of overlooks, Klingman's Dome there, and that's about 6,600 feet, so you're automatically higher than that if you just go up there and look out.
Well, let me show you a short video for all the flat earthers out there, okay? This is a friend of ours, Barry Wilmore, who's an astronaut. He's been a commander on the space shuttle. He's been up there on the International Space Station, and this is a video that was taken at the point in the Earth's orbit around the sun where the International Space Station orbit around the Earth is perpendicular to the sun. So therefore the sun never sets. And it's a 13-second video that's sped up to show a complete 90-minute International Space Station orbit around the Earth, traveling at 17,500 miles per hour. And so the solar arrays are evident as they track the sun. So watch this, and you'll see the flat Earth. See the flat Earth
there? To me.
Yep, totally round.
But they would claim that because that's NASA and all that, that those are fake.
I mean, Barry is a Christian.
I know.
Has his own Christian ministry.
Yeah. And so we need to, obviously they were going to do a documentary actually on him on the Science Channel about his, wanting to do this and to try to prove this. And so, so that's obviously not going to happen now, but it's sad that he even said in an article, question everything, that he wants people to question.
So we should question those people who say those videos are fake.
And we should question him questioning everything.
Yeah.
So, well,
anyway.
A lot of people on watching today, and they can't wait for the first two articles on genetics because Georgia Purdom chose
And
that.
someone says here, glad to see the original gang. Mr. Ham looks older. Laugh out loud.
Well, that's true. I am older than I was the last time I was here. That is a true scientific statement.
Well, we all are.
Yeah,
that's right. I'm older.
Exactly. Hey, wanted to mention we have an Easter conference coming up, and the Easter conference is on climate change. Climate change, physical and spiritual climate change. So we have some experts coming to deal with the physical climate change aspects, and we'll also be talking on spiritual climate change. So it's a unique conference, and we have Carl Beisner there from the Cornwall Alliance, who specialise in climate change.
Yep.
And we also have Ray Comfort coming. We're going to have an Easter morning sunrise service like we did last year.
Yeah, Dr. Alan White's going to be there.
People just love that.
Yeah, Dr.
Bodie
Alan.
Hodge is going to be speaking there. Georgia Purdom's going to be speaking there. Ken Ham's going to be speaking there.
All right.
So,
you know what? We'll probably all look older, too.
And we're going to have a specialist on the Ice Age.
Yeah.
And Dr. Andrew Snelling, dealing with geology, and Dr. Gabriela Haynes, our Brazilian paleontologist.
Yep. She'll be
It's
there.
going to be an incredible
It's a whole
conference.
lineup.
So people
Great
can link to that, find information. Then one more thing before we go to genetics, and that is jobs. We have lots of jobs going at Answers in Genesis, the Creation Museum, the Ark Encounter, in just about every area, housekeeping, IT, in customer service, in HR, and it just goes on and on everywhere.
Right.
So people interested in applying for a job, go to answersingenesis.org/jobs jobs and found out all the jobs are available. It's a Christian ministry. It's an opportunity to work in a cutting-edge Christian ministry.
Yeah, so, and we need you.
We have about 500 full-time staff members, and we actually have about 700 seasonals. Of course, that really increases during the summer.
Correct.
And we have some seasonals with full-time equivalents and so on. But there's hundreds of people that work at Answers in Genesis.
Yeah.
All right, so our first article on genetics is Genome Stability, Intricate Process of DNA Repair Discovered. And so what this covers is, so when DNA is in the nucleus and it breaks, so there's like a double-stranded break, which means both strands obviously break apart. They thought that the DNA just sort of floated around, I guess, until it found these repair enzymes and repair mechanisms to be able to fix it. Well, to their surprise, because they probably believe in evolution and that the cell is really simple, they actually found that this is a very, very complex process for repairing the DNA. And so what happens is there's these little liquid droplets of have DNA repair proteins in them that sort of go around the double-stranded break. And they get bigger and bigger, and then finally it's like a spider web that sort of sends out these web parts to hook them to highways in the cell, microtubules, that then pulls it along so it goes to the DNA hospital in the nucleus of the cell where it's fixed.
See, two things. Number one, they didn't even know that this repair mechanism sort of existed like that, and it's so complex. I mean, we thought DNA was complex. I don't think we understand much about DNA ultimately compared to what there is to know.
We only know a tiny fraction of what there is to know.
And it's so complex. How could that evolve by chance random processes?
Yeah. Well, what did the cell do in the meantime? I mean, how did it fix this stuff?
Until the repair mechanism evolved. It doesn't make sense.
Right.
Yeah, the dumb luck,
The other thing is, I have a theological question for you.
Oh, no. Okay.
Okay. So a repair mechanism like this, which is so complex and fantastic, so did God create living things with a repair mechanism knowing they would need it in a fallen world, or is it part of the perfect world before the fall because things are just kept going perfectly?
I think it's probably a combination of things. I think there are obviously definitely more active repair mechanisms in a fallen world because there's so many more things that can affect our DNA. But even UV light can cause DNA to mutate or change. So even in a pre-fall world, they would have been exposed to those things. But they worked perfectly back then, right? These repair mechanisms worked perfectly, so they never had mutations, they never had problems. But in an imperfect fallen world, these things don't work perfectly, and so we do.
So this gives us a taste of how these kind of things could have occurred in a perfect world to keep everything perfectly functional.
Right.
Well, so in a perfect world, you think of bacteria and viruses all involved in keeping everything balanced and so on. And now, of course, they get out of balance because of the fall. Well, the same sort of thing could have happened here to keep everything perfectly balanced. But now, because of the fall, things get out of balance, so to speak.
I remember, you go back to Darwin's day, and a cell was like a black box. They couldn't look into it. Once they were able to look inside the cell, they saw how intricate it was. And a lot of people have described it as like a miniature factory. And, the more we look at it, the more detail that we find out. And, we read things like this. It's like you've got these little ambulances that move the DNA, and it goes to the hospital, and then it gets repaired. I mean, this is more like a little miniature city.
Oh, definitely.
Not just a factory. I mean, it's just a factory and cities all built in together.
I would agree with that, definitely.
It's just
hey, before we go to the next one, we have a confession to make that we're going to have to admit to all the atheists out there. There's nobody at the Creation Museum today.
Well, there's people, there's employees.
There's staff. We have no live audience.
This is true. Well, there are some people here, but they're staff.
They're staff. And the reason we don't have the live audience or nobody's visiting the Creation Museum today is because for January and February, in the winter months, we actually closed on Sundays and Mondays, enable us to do all sorts of maintenance and repair and cleaning, and I see them all up there today doing all sorts of things.
Yeah,
It'll make
things are pulled out.
So nice looking, ready for the real busy time. But you know what we find? People who normally come on the Sundays or Mondays come on the Saturday or the Tuesday, and actually the numbers for January and February have been up compared to last year, even in the winter months. So
well, and we have our kids 10 and under free this year too, so people want to take advantage of that, I'm sure, as well. So.
Now, somebody asked here, are we going to be streaming the conference, the Easter conference? And the answer is we'll be streaming certain of the sessions.
Certain ones.
Certain of the sessions are streamed, but encourage people to come full time. And somebody said, I wish I lived in the Kentucky area. I would love to work for you guys. Move here.
Move here, yeah.
There's a solution to that.
Solution for that.
So, you know, Avery's one of our team.
I know.
And she's our token millennial. She's sitting in the front seat.
Very pregnant.
And very pregnant. And she's about to give birth, and she's having labor pains while we're sitting here. I'm a bit worried about this.
Either that or she's laughing too hard.
All right.
Okay, next article. Genes from scratch, far more common and important than we thought. So what evolution needs is the ability to make new genetic information. Because if you're going to go from one kind of organism to another kind of organism.
Right, like a single-celled organism to a dog, you're going to have to add information.
You got to add. You can't just tweak what's already there. Okay, you're going to have to add new genetic information.
Right.
So the question has always been, well, how do you do that, right? Because how does random chance generate something like that?
See, what I don't understand, okay, I read this article, here's what I don't understand. They're talking about these orphan genes, right? And they're talking about these genes, they don't seem to appear in anything what they thought was,
they're unique to a particular organism.
And from an evolutionary perspective, they haven't appeared before. So how could they be generated? But wait a minute. What about how did life get generated in the first place?
Great question.
From their viewpoint, that's a great question. These orphan genes, or the de novo emergence is what they call it. These are brand new genes that are functional, that have to fully exist for it to be able to do a particular function.
Right.
Where do they come from?
Right.
We don't observe those things just coming from nowhere. And even in this research, when I first saw the article, I'm like, oh, wow, are they actually trying to find one that actually just comes about? And that's not what the article's actually about.
They don't want to deal with origin of life issues. They want to deal with what happened after that, right? Yeah. So that's what this article is dealing with. And, they even talk about how genes can change via mutations, and they say there's serious defects it can cause, it can have little impact. Well, those things we definitely observe, but then it says, well, others give significant advantages. Well, they might, like you think about antibiotic resistance in bacteria, but that's not causing it to move to another type of organism.
Right,
that's not the type of
That's not really developing new
novel
orphan genes, if you will.
Right.
That's actually a detriment to a gene, a loss of information, but it had a beneficial outcome.
Bingo.
One of the things we've always said is that processes in regard to natural selection, mutation, and so on, operate on the genetic information that's already there.
Right, correct.
What they're really trying to do here is to say, how did that genetic information get there? The code system, how did it all get there? That's what they're really saying, aren't they?
Well, and they're trying to say, well, maybe some of this maybe these new genes came from junk DNA. Well, the thing is,
like
junk
cousin genetics.
Yeah,
if you
it's
will.
a bad name for it because that DNA in between the genes isn't just doing nothing, it's doing something, and it's really, really important. So you just see them sort of grasping for straws all throughout this article because they don't understand where these genes come from, but they're trying to explain.
Well, you know what?
For example, when they're looking at genes, what they're trying to do is they're trying to say, okay, where did certain genes come from? And they say, well, maybe they mutated from these other genes because these look similar to another one. And so that's, they call that the missing relatives. But, when they started looking at that, they assumed most of them would come from something like that. And when they looked, they're like, okay, there's a lot of genes that don't look anything like others.
2/3 of them don't.
Yeah, 2/3. So they were like, okay, well, those must have just been de novo emergence genes. They just say it.
Well, let me sum up this whole article here in 4 words. In the beginning, God.
Yeah.
Boom.
Unfortunately, that's missing from this article, but that's...
Because you don't just need genes. You got to understand you need regulation of genes. You need other genes that produce proteins to interact with it. It's not simple at all.
Right.
And I love they said order seems like something that's hard to achieve.
Yeah.
It's hard to achieve
By random chance.
without an infinite intelligence, without a
And we're
creating
not
God.
observing it. We don't see it.
Right.
That was the one thing that I gathered. After
Yeah.
reading this, I'm like, okay, if we observed any of this, we're not. We're not observing orphan genes being made.
Somebody mentioned the Falling Flat book.
Oh, yeah, we forgot to mention
Bodhi,
that.
you forgot to
I was
mention
going to mention it later, but that's fine. The very first article, we were talking about Mad Mike and believing in a flat Earth. Dr. Danny Faulkner, our astronomer here at the ministry, has written a book, Falling Flat. It's a refutation of flat Earth claims. It not only goes through the scientific claims, but also the alleged biblical support for a flat Earth. I don't know if you guys have seen little memes that say 200 verses that support a flat Earth. You look them up, they actually don't.
Yeah.
And a lot of people are confused at that. He goes into those. And so it's an excellent book, and I do want to encourage people to
Have you thought about why do we see this flat Earth phenomenon? There's even a conference on the flat Earth.
Yeah.
I mean, Danny Faulkner attended it, actually.
Right, yeah, he did.
Sure did.
He
Yeah.
wanted to hear what
Yes,
they were saying.
he'll walk right
I
in
think
there.
people they want to believe almost the bizarre and the unusual and things that stir the pot.
Don't you think some people are just doing it just to stir, just for fun?
Hey, you know
Yeah.
what?
think
The
it's
same types of people are saying the same things about UFOs and aliens
Yeah.
and things like that. So I mean, we're seeing this all across the board with certain people.
Yeah.
As soon as you give up the authority of God and His Word,
Right.
you can believe almost
Everything
anything.
becomes possible.
You
Yeah.
hate
All
to put
right.
it that way.
HGTV features first ever throuple on House Hunters. Viewers share praise, express shock. Okay, so
Okay, before you go on,
familiar.
just before you go on, I looked up the word thruple,
Throuple.
and I found out that you only really find the word thruple or thriple. Did you know there's a thriple
Okay.
or thruple
Thruple.
That's
in
right.
the Urban Dictionary?
Yeah.
But in any of the main dictionaries,
Yeah, you'll
there's no
not
such
find
word
it.
as thruple.
Yeah. Because it's describing basically a relationship between a married couple, in this case, a married couple, and then another woman. So they all live together, and they're trying to find, obviously, a house together. So the woman in the marriage is bisexual, and so they decided to have another woman enter the relationship so that she could, I guess,
And
live
they
out
had
those
some sort of
ideas.
commitment ceremony
Right.
of admitting this woman. Really, this is what you call polyamory.
Right.
Polyamory.
Because they
And-
can't all three be legally married.
And as we've said over and over again, when you don't have an absolute authority, you don't build your thinking on the Bible, and then when you know, as a culture, legalize gay marriage and so on, well, ultimately
door to
anything goes. When there's no king, when there's no absolute authority, everyone does what is right in his own eyes. So it's really a part of the secular worldview. They're being consistent with their foundation
Right.
of saying there's no God, the Bible's not true. Well, this is being totally consistent with that.
Well, you know, in the Bible, there's a word for this. It's called a concubine. You actually have an extra woman or whatever, you know, that's involved. And, you know, not that I'm saying that, you know, the Bible says, hey, this is a good thing.
Right.
We do see examples of that sort of thing. We also see examples of polygamy.
Which we'll talk more about next.
Right, yeah, the next article talks about some of that. But, you know, I mean, we see examples of that going all the way back to the book of Genesis. Early in the book of Genesis, we have Lamech, before the flood, took 2 wives. You know, we have instances, you know, a lot of people might remember what happened with Jacob, you know, with 2 wives and a couple of concubines and
Solomon.
13 children. Solomon, oh my.
It's interesting, and we can talk about this with the next article that
yeah.
deals with polygamy, but what's interesting is that atheists all the time are bringing up on social media and other places about, oh, well, the Bible has polygamy in it, and the Bible has, you know, concubines and all. Well, the Bible has all sorts of things in
Right,
it because it's a
right. That
book
doesn't
all
about
sorts of things.
reality.
Yeah. It doesn't make them right or think that God's
No,
saying
and
we're right.
It goes
yeah.
against the created order. God created a man and a woman, and which is the basis for marriage. And so, you know, that's the key, is going back, looking at it in a perfect world. In a fallen world, we're going to see all sorts of things that get messed
But
up.
here's the interesting thing. Have you noticed, like the HGTV on the House Hunters? I mean, people have sort of looked on HGTV as sort of, you know, family friendly and so on. But now we see them introducing
Everybody's
this sort of thing.
signaling, right? Everybody.
Disney is got
Hallmark.
this cartoon
Yeah.
coming with a blatantly gay character, and more we see this happening in certain movies
Right.
and other places. And there's a real push for this minority viewpoint, and it is a minority,
Yeah.
a very small minority, to try to force it on the whole culture.
Right.
Right.
Somebody said our language is always evolving, not always for the best. I'm like, yeah, that's true.
It's getting that
Yeah.
way. There's hardly anything you can watch on TV anymore, and
Yeah.
you know, Netflix is totally pagan and horrible. And
Yeah. Well, I mean, we see this sort of thing, and you know, the key is always go back and check things against Scripture.
Yeah.
I mean, I want to encourage, particularly church members, go back, check all matter of things against the absolute authority of the Word of God, and you know, that's how
And
we
that's
get our
where
standards.
we should mention that in regard to this next one, as Georgia does it, you know, polygamy. So people bring up all the time, I have atheists bring up all the time on social media and other places, yeah, but the Bible condones polygamy. Well, the Bible doesn't condone polygamy, but let's talk about that as we discuss this
Okay, so
article.
this next article is Utah law would decriminalize polygamy among consenting adults. So right now, polygamy is illegal in the state of Utah. It is a felony, but they want to make it just an infraction or whatever they call it, not something that basically they would be put in prison for. But as I said in the article, they don't actually even enforce the law, even though it is against it. They rarely enforce it, and and it's almost silly. It's like, well, there's so much of it going on, and even though there's a law against it, people don't follow it. So let's just decriminalize it. And I'm like, no, you enforce the law. I mean, that's the reason it's so rampant is because you're not enforcing the law in the first place.
Right, yeah, when we were chatting ahead of time, you're like, the same sort of thing happens with drugs, and we're starting to see people decriminalize certain drugs as if that's going to solve the problem. It really doesn't. One of the things the article says is the law is a failure. It hasn't stopped polygamy at all, and it's actually enabled abuse to occur and remain unchecked. Well, you know what? The same thing can be said about slavery. I mean, we have human trafficking going on. Well, the law's failed. Does that mean you throw it out? No. Start enforcing the law.
Well, the other thing here, they're quoting some of the women who have been in these polygamous situations who talk about the abuse that goes on, and they're warning about it as well. But okay, so in the Bible we do read about polygamy, and people say, well, wait a minute, Solomon had many wives, and there are many others in the Bible that had many wives and so on. Well, when you read through it all, I mean, you see where there are negative consequences because of all this. But the first thing is, we've got God's word, the complete written word, and Jesus in Matthew 19, and again recorded in Mark 10, reiterates there what the created order is in regard to marriage. Haven't you read, he which made the beginning made them male and female, quoting from Genesis 1:27, and then Genesis 2:24, for this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and cleave unto his wife, and they'll be one flesh. Based on the woman was made from the man, you got one male, one female. So the teaching in Scripture is very plain. The marriage that God created is one man and one woman. Now, what's interesting is, we know more about that teaching in detail than people hundreds and hundreds or thousands of years ago, because there has been a progressive revelation, and now we've got God's complete written word. But the interesting thing I read in one of the sources I looked up is that polygamy in the Old Testament, it's not hidden from us in regard to the problems that it causes, but God doesn't condemn it in the same way he does, say, adultery, as you read about with the Israelites. And the reason is because adultery, fornication, destroy marriage and destroy the family. Polygamy still maintains family units, but at a lesser level with all sorts of problems, but it doesn't outright destroy it in that sense.
But God doesn't praise it either, or say it's okay. No. It was allowed, it was permitted, but it's not that he praised it or anything like that.
But we've got no excuse these days if you believe the Bible, if you base your worldview on the Bible. But polygamy is particularly being associated with the Mormons, right?
Right. They've deviated from the Bible. They try to add.
Weren't their founders
Joseph
people
Smith,
who condone polygamy?
Guys, if people want to know more about that, we've actually got stuff written up on that particular subject. We have the World Religions and Cults, Volume 1. There's an entire chapter on Mormonism, how they've deviated some of their belief systems and some of the problems with that. We also have a book series called How Do We Know the Bible is True, Volume 1 and Volume 2, and that looks at a lot of general apologetics. One of the questions answered in there is, what about polygamy? And it takes a look at that, and it's interesting, we mentioned slavery earlier. There's actually a chapter in there too. What's the difference between biblical slavery and, say, the harsh slavery that we saw in Egypt or in the United States and England and some of the other parts of the Western world?
Yeah, it's very different, isn't it?
It's a very different, one's more like a bankruptcy law, and it was temporary. And you voluntarily entered it.
And again, you'll see atheists and others who are mocking the Bible talk about slavery in the Bible, but they don't even know. They just regurgitate what they've heard. But it's nothing like the slavery that you're talking about that was in the United States and so on. And it was totally different.
And we shouldn't really be surprised, that this is happening now too, because back when homosexual marriage was approved by the Supreme Court, that was one of the things that Chief Justice Roberts said in his dissenting opinion was, why, if we're saying that men and men can marry and women can marry, well, why should it stop there? Why shouldn't it be other things? And he's absolutely right, That's coming true right now.
Well, we even said, why not pedophilia? And there's been more and more pushes for that as well.
Attacks on children,
it's just incredible what's going on. By the way, somebody here made a comment. we said, you know, we are back. The A-team is back, and they called us the originals.
The originals.
I like that.
I like that. That's
the
good.
originals.
The classics.
The originals.
The classics.
All right. Ancient humans.
Next time we do this, we should do it in black and
somebody
white.
said the classics like the Three Stooges.
Oh, that's
Oh,
good.
my. Okay, yeah.
All right. Ancient humans in the Sahara ate fish before the lakes dried up. So what they have found is fossil evidence of fish like tilapia and I think they say catfish and some things like that in the Sahara Desert, which is obviously extremely dry.
Particularly in a cave,
right,
near one of these formations.
Yeah, and so so when we were talking about this article, it's kind of obvious to us that this is probably some sort of post-flood body of water that was there after the flood, and then as time went on, it dried up.
Right, we have to understand, after the flood, you know, the world would have been a lot more lush. I mean, it was fairly wet. You know, we probably had a lot more precipitation, things like that, to keep these things going for quite some time, you know, until famines and things like that set in, which really triggered a lot of desertification. So, you know, seeing something like this makes sense. We've seen a lot of evidence of the Sahara having forests and things like that. So this
Okay,
fits in, yeah.
so I just don't understand something here. Maybe something wrong with my logic. Maybe I need to listen to AOC more or something.
Not that.
So the Sahara Desert, there's a lot of things that have been written about the Sahara Desert that when they've done certain
Excavations
mapping and
things,
being able to look down through the layers and so on, they see evidence there were streams and evidence that used to be very lush, and there were lakes, and here there were fish and so on. And now it's desert. So
Desert.
there has been climate change in the past before motor cars.
Right.
So was it the Egyptian chariots with running around with carbon dioxide coming out that did this?
I don't know. Maybe those horses really gave off a lot of gas.
Maybe all horses of the Egyptians? Is that what I
It
mean?
just shows you climates change, right?
Yeah.
This isn't anything new.
Right.
They do, and they were changing more back then than they are even now.
Right.
There was these drastic changes that were occurring, but people adapted and they dealt with it. Animals and all these things.
Right,
you know, it's not.
Now, I think we have some hints in the Bible that explain some of this. You go all the way back to Abraham's day in Genesis chapter 12. There's a great famine that caused Abraham to go down to Egypt. At the time of Isaac in Genesis 26, we saw that. You can't forget the one from Joseph's day. You know, in Genesis 41, there are the surrounding passages. 7 years of famine, so much that people from all over the world came to get grain from them.
Right.
So, I mean, we see these types of examples. Is this when some of the deserts were really forming or getting worse? Yeah, it's possible. You know, definitely.
What about in the Midwest? Wasn't there a big dust bowl there many years ago? I mean, there's been all sorts of climate change. Climate continues to change. Maybe, and you know, we're in a slightly warming trend right now, but then we could go into a cooling trend again. The sun has a lot to do with it. The phases of the sun.
Think of something else. You know, the flood triggered an ice age, which takes a lot of water out of the ocean. It takes it out of a lot of bodies of water. It puts it on land. That's going to automatically shift up all sorts of weather conditions to trigger these types of things, you know, as the ice age goes and as it goes back. So, you know, a lot of this, if you look cross-disciplinary, it actually makes an awful lot of sense.
By the way, somebody here made a comment in regard to the last article dealing with polygamy and the Bible and so on. God also told the kings of Israel not to take multiple wives. There is a specific verse in Scripture that said for the kings not to add wives unto themselves. And
I know priests
they
were
did,
told not
and
to
those
do
that did had massive problems, as we can see.
All right, kids learn about animals evolution during Darwin Day at Discovery Science Place. So this is in East Texas, and they basically, February 12th that celebrates Darwin Day, because that's his birthday. And so they're trying to teach these kids by looking at animals and science just in general that evolution is true. And yet, that's not really, I mean, by showing them that animals adapt to their surroundings is not evolution. That's just change, right? They're not changing from one organism to another. They're just changing slightly. So they're really, as we look throughout this whole article, they're really mixing up observational science with historical science.
Yeah, for whatever animals that are listed in here that they showed the children, they could say, we know what this is, and we know which family it belongs to. In other words, it's fully functional. We know what kind it is. But it's interesting. They say this. Darwin Day is a celebration of the world around us. It's a celebration of our understanding of evolution. Well, I tell you what the celebration really is. It's in Romans 1, verse 25. They worship the creature rather than the creator. That's what the celebration is all about. And they're indoctrinating these kids. You know what they're really telling these kids? Oh, look at these wonderful animals and Darwin and evolution, and it's all true. Kids, there's no God. Everything came about by natural processes. Life is purposeless and meaningless. Isn't this great? Let's celebrate.
Yeah.
That's really what they're doing.
There was one line where somebody there said, science doesn't rob us of the emotional joy of celebrating life. I'm like, yes, it does, or it should. If you're consistent with it and you realize you just go to dust when you die, what's the point?
You know, one of the things it says in here too, it says Darwin Day is celebrated annually around the world on the birthday of biologist Charles Darwin, who is known for his scientific theory of evolution and natural selection. First off, was Charles Darwin a biologist?
No.
No, he was actually a
theologian.
Yeah. He got his degree as a theologian. Now, is this a scientific theory, observable, repeatable? No. A theory,
it's an idea.
Maybe an idea or a hypothesis, but it's definitely not a theory. And the natural selection was actually around prior to Darwin. He just gave a name to it and said, let's try to use that as a mechanism.
He used it as a mechanism,
you know, evolution goes all the way back to the Epicureans, some of the ancient Greeks. It's a Greek mythology. He just added fuel to that one and brought it back.
Well, here they are talking about, you know, Darwinian evolution and so on. Then at the end of the article, they say, this event is meant to show children science continues to advance, such as gaining new knowledge on DNA and genetics. Well, wait a minute. Now they've jumped to observational science, where you can actually study DNA and genetics. They jump from their belief that one kind changed into another.
Well, they said in here too, everything is relevant to evolution. And sadly, I mean, but think about what that foundation leads you to. It leads you to survival of the fittest. It leads you to eugenics. It leads you to all these horrible things that we really don't want in our society. If they were consistent, they would realize that.
You know, they were teaching these kids, all organisms work together. You know, they're saying this like it's a positive thing. Everything works together in a system. The ants are a good example of that. Hey, would they say the same thing about bed bugs? Or coronavirus? No, you see, they're still biased in the way they try to point this out to the kids. It's very deceptive. We need to be praying for the kids in this next generation.
As somebody said here, that Darwin Day is nothing more than a celebration of the rebellion against God.
Well said.
And we offer camps here to educate kids called Explore Camps. We're going to put a link here in the comments so you can see that. Where your kids can come and experience science from a biblical creation worldview this summer in both June and July. So check out those camps.
Hey, I know we're out of time, but we could not do this one now, but we'll do this one.
We'll do it next Monday.
Next Monday on Neanderthal and burials and flowers.
Kind of neat stuff they found.
And all that sort of stuff.
All right.
We'll see you next Monday. Bye.